One-time enemies with a common cause. Egypt and Israel talk trade, tunnels and what they see as terrorism. It comes at a time of heightened tension in the Middle East. So where is the Egypt-Israel relationship heading? Hello and welcome to this edition of Inside Egypt. I'm Sami Zeidan. Well, they've been old adversaries and uneasy allies, but Egypt and Israel are finding more in common as they face up to domestic and regional challenges. Egypt is at the heart of the mediation effort between Israel and Hamas as efforts continue to resolve the conflict in Gaza. Egypt and Israel also see a halt to the flow of weapons and fighters through those tunnels from Gaza as a security priority. And then there is the shared interest in energy and how to cope with soaring demand. Well, Egypt was a major exporter of gas to Israel. Now there are multi-billion-dollar plans to see that flow reversed. Electricity prices have reached record levels in Israel, and Egypt is facing some of the most severe summer power shortages in recent memory. Factories have been shut, small businesses badly hit by blackouts. Some homes have even been without power for more than 12 hours a day. Well, it's a problem that's been years in the making, with successive governments accused of neglecting Egypt's energy sector. One issue is a severe shortage of natural gas to fuel electricity plants, and here's where Egypt and Israel think they can help each other out. You see, Israel currently has 6 prospective offshore fields with an estimated 35 trillion cubic feet of gas. Well, the biggest of these are the Leviathan and Tamar gas fields. Negotiations are taking place to pipe gas to liquefaction plants in Egypt for export and domestic consumption. Israel and the Palestinian Authority have also been discussing how to develop the marine gas field off the coast of Gaza. Talks, it's understood, though, have not included Hamas. Well, here's a possible clue about why. Speaking back in 2007, Israeli Defense Minister and former Army Chief of Staff Moshe Ya'alon said proceeds of a Palestinian gas sale to Israel would likely not trickle down to help an impoverished Palestinian public. Rather, based on Israel's past experience, the proceeds will likely serve to fund further terror attacks against Israel. End quote. So let me introduce our guest now for this edition of Inside Egypt. Joining us from London is Omar Ashour, author and senior lecturer in Middle East politics and security studies at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. From Vancouver, Robert Springborg, visiting professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London. And also in London, we have Daniel Levy, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programme at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He's also a former Israeli negotiator and advisor to the Israeli Prime Minister's office. Good to have you with us, gentlemen. If I could start with Omar, first of all. Do Egypt and Israel see eye to eye on issues more these days because, once again, Egypt has a president with a military background?
It's more complex than that. Egypt always had presidents from military background, except for Mohamed Morsi, and the relationship ebbed and flowed from severe animosity under President Nasser to more of collaboration and even alliance in the during the 1990s under President Mubarak, and then under Sisi at the moment. I think what's happening here is it has to be placed in a regional context where you have competing regional coalitions and you have also a bit of interests between the leadership of the military establishment at the moment and the current Israeli government. The interests intersect on security matters vis-à-vis Hamas in Gaza, the idea that the Sisi regime perceive it as an extension of the Muslim Brothers, and therefore undermining it is empowering him against his domestic rivals. The idea of demilitarizing and disarming Gaza and demilitarizing and disarming the Sinai Peninsula is both appealing for the Israeli government and for the Sisi regime in Egypt.
Okay, but Omar, I mean, compared
but also,
to,
as you mentioned in the report,
compared to the official Egyptian approach under Morsi, when you had a civilian elected administration, isn't there a change in policy here?
Yeah, there is a major change in policy on some aspects, but also a continuation on others. Under Morsi, the official line of the Egyptian security policy has not changed in terms of destroying tunnels to Gaza, between Sinai and Gaza, in terms of trying to keep Gaza a responsibility of the Israelis as opposed to a responsibility for the Egyptians. But you also saw some changes in rhetoric. You know, Morsi was quite clear in not or sending these signals of not mentioning Israel. You had more influence over Hamas, as we saw in the brokered ceasefire in 2012, where the presidency played a critical role, which was a traditional playground for the general intelligence. You also saw a bit of a change now, you know, where you see more or less intelligence collaboration. You saw even, you know, prolonging the war as opposed to ending the war was in the benefit of the current regime under Sisi. And you know, the 15th of July statement of the ceasefire, you know,
right,
that was coordinated with the Israelis and not inviting Hamas or any of the other partners, was a very clear statement that you know, the idea was to marginalize the Gaza dimension in this story and more or less further the interest of the military establishment in Egypt and the Israeli government.
Perhaps it'd be useful now perhaps to recap on the history of Egypt's improving relationship with Israel. And it was, of course, Egypt's military that paved the way for those improved ties. The peace treaty, which was signed in 1979, was, as we all know, initialed on the Egyptian side by an ex-military president, Anwar al-Sadat. That led to enhanced military and intelligence cooperation in the 1980s, strongly encouraged by the United States. Now, relations continued to grow under another ex-military president, Hosni Mubarak, and in 1993, Egyptian and Israeli former intelligence officials established an oil refinery company, Midor, to export energy from Egypt to Israel. Well, the Mubarak government also helped Israel during the 2006 siege of Gaza by sealing its border with the Strip. If I could bring Robert into the conversation. Is the Egyptian military perhaps the institution that's most familiar with Israel?
Well, if we include under the military, the excuse me, the security establishment, then yes, that's the case. Excuse me, it has been the security establishment that has been most responsible for the relationship, including the diplomatic relationship that Omar has just been describing. The gas deal really fell under the presidency. It wasn't under the military, and some elements of the military were not happy, in fact, how the Mubarak government handled that. So the military has its own interest, but the presidents of Egypt have been careful to ensure that the military not really have direct relationships with Israel, because the presidents of Egypt have themselves been threatened by their military. So it's been an intelligence matter. It's been one handled out of the presidential palace, with the military to some extent in the background.
All right, Daniel Levy. As we know, Egypt relies on a lot of aid from the United States. A big chunk of that aid is military aid. As concerns were raised or are being raised about human rights in Egypt and so on and so forth, does winning the favor of pro-Israel lobbies become even more crucial to the Egyptian government?
Well, Sami, I think as others have said, that there's nothing that new about this Israel-Egypt relationship, certainly not when it comes to the security establishments. But I think one of the new factors is the intensification of certain elements of the relationship, and certainly the one that you just pointed to, which is that I think the Egyptian government under Sisi coming to power in the way that it did, with the removal of a democratically elected president, with the kind of crackdown that we have seen in the past year in Egypt, was feeling more heat in the United States, in Congress, and in that respect, having Israel on side in Washington, having the pro-Israel community on side in Washington, a significant lobbying influence, I think is very useful to this Egyptian leadership. It's a role that people may remember the Israel lobby played in support of Turkey in the past, when the Israel-Turkey relationship was very close. Congress would be discouraged from taking measures on the Armenian issue, for instance. Today, Turkey has a more independent foreign policy. That relationship looks very different, but it's coming into play with Egypt. But I think one should also just zoom out a moment, Sami, and there's a bigger point here, which is that I think for both Israel and Egypt, and especially here on the Israeli side, as people think about what the American pivot, as it's been called, away from the Middle East, what the lighter American footprint in the region means, I think that for the Israelis, there is a real eagerness to say, can Egypt be a real anchor of Israel's relationships in the region? I think the relationship in that respect is intensified, is closer than ever, and I tend to think, though, that the Israelis may be overplaying their card in thinking the Egyptians can deliver more in the region than they probably can. You referred back to the peace treaty there of the late 70s. Of course, when Egypt went out on a limb on its own with Israel, it was perceived to have abandoned the Palestinian cause and was actually somewhat isolated in the Arab world rather than being able to deliver the Arab world.
All right. Omar Ashour, since we're talking about, I think both you and Daniel are underscoring the point that relations between Egypt and Israel seem to be intensifying, at least when it comes, at the very least, on the security front. Is that intensification coming at the cost of Palestinian interests, particularly in Gaza, Omar?
I think so. Just to continue the line that Daniel has mentioned already, I think what's happening here is there is a common security interests between the current military-dominated regime in Egypt and the government, which has to more or less undermine the authorities in Gaza, Hamas authorities in particular in Gaza, and preferably at a later stage, install more of a loyalist entity there that rules. So any war that undermine the military capacity of Hamas is for both sides is beneficial. There's also intersection in what's happening in Sinai. We know that there was multiple Israeli operations to target specific militants in Hamas and in Sinai. And these operations, interestingly, were without collateral damages. That's only the suspect were killed, not his family, not his neighbors. And this was, on the other hand, when the Egyptian army does these operations, they do more collateral damage in the Sinai Peninsula. So there is this intersecting interest in this in these two sections.
Right.
And this reminds us a bit of the policy under Hosni Mubarak, especially in 2006 war on Lebanon. When he was more or less very supportive of the war effort to undermine Hezbollah, which he perceived as a regional enemy and as an extension of the Islamist forces in Egypt. But that obviously backfired because there was a lot of public support and a decry of the Mubarak foreign policy then. And all of that featured in 2011. We forget that in the January uprising, the flags of the Palestinians were there. The issue of the security and the intelligence sharing between the general intelligence and the Mossad was highlighted quite significantly against Omar Suleiman back then. And also the corruption deals and the gas deals were also highlighted.
We'll come to the corruption and the gas deals in a moment. Forgive me for interrupting, but I put that question to what extent perhaps is Hamas worried about the strengthening of the relationship between Egypt and Israel, and whether that poses or comes at a cost of Palestinian interests. I put that question to the deputy chairman of Hamas's political office, and this is what he had to say.
لأنها تريد أن تضع إسفينا بين الفلسطينيين والمصريين من جانب وتضع إسفينا آخر بين.
There is no doubt Israeli-Egyptian bilateral relations have improved recently, especially if you look at various reports. However, these reports are malicious, as they are meant to drive a wedge between the Palestinians and Egypt, and also between Egyptians and other Arab countries. Egypt is acting as an intermediary between the Palestinian resistance in Gaza and Israel. As such, it should be an impartial broker, whether we like it or not.
So do you see no shift in Egypt's policy towards Hamas?
نعم صحيح هناك في تغيرات في موقف مصر اتجاه حماس.
It is true there are certain changes in Egypt's stance towards Hamas, and we should work on remedying these changes and attempt to rectify our positions. We advise the Egyptians not to go on further in this direction.
What sort of policy shifts do you see coming from Egypt towards Hamas then?
تغيرات كثيرة. هم حاولوا في كل وسائل الإعلام المصرية.
There have been many changes. The Egyptian media has been demonizing Hamas, falsely accusing it of many acts. Even there were attempts to initiate legal actions against Hamas before the courts, all of which of course are false and untrue. Based on this, policies aiming at severing relations with Hamas have been introduced. In fact, during the recent war on Gaza, Egypt dealt with Hamas as part of a larger Palestinian delegation, whereas in the past, Hamas would be dealt with directly.
Daniel, was the Hamas official there choosing his words carefully? I mean, how radical do you see an Egyptian policy shift towards Hamas?
Well, I think one is cognizant of the fact that they are going to choose their words carefully. Certainly a Hamas official who I believe mostly resides in Egypt. The Morsi presidency was a very brief hiatus, Sami. It was 1 year. I think it was true to say that you saw shifts coming out of the presidency, not necessarily out of the military and security establishment. Today, one of those intensified aspects of the Israel-Egypt relationship, which has changed since General and then President Sisi has been in power, is that they see a shared agenda in going after Hamas. However, and this is what I think is very interesting to point out, their interests do not exactly overlap. And the divergence when it comes to this latest conflict with Gaza is significant. Because I think the question here is, how far-reaching are the goals of the Egyptians as opposed to the Israelis when it comes to Hamas? And here I think their agendas do diverge. Egypt, I think, has an eradicationist position towards Hamas. It sees Hamas as an extension of its fight with the Muslim Brotherhood at home. And I think for Egypt, a desirable goal would be to see Hamas fully removed from power in Gaza. Contrast that to the position of the Israeli Prime Minister. I think Prime Minister Netanyahu saw the goal as weakening Hamas, but leaving Hamas in power. First of all, to actually remove Hamas would be very, very costly to Israel, take a long time, a lot of casualties, going in on the ground, no exit strategy. But also, Israel finds Hamas useful. Hamas is more of a challenge than Fatah and the PA, but it's also useful for propaganda domestically, for propaganda in the West to be able to depict the enemy as Hamas, and it's also part of Israel's strategy to keep the Palestinians divided, to keep the West Bank and Gaza divided. So I think here you had an element of conflicting goals between the Israelis and the Egyptians, and partly Egypt's inability to be a mediator is because in many respects Egypt under President Sisi is a party to this conflict against Hamas.
It sounds almost surreal listening to that analysis, Omar Ashour. I mean, the idea that perhaps the Egyptian authorities now want to go even further in a more extreme policy towards Hamas than even the Israeli government does. At the end of the day, Hamas is still there. And one wonders whether a strengthening of relations between Israel and Egypt, without an end to some of the core problems in the Middle East, like occupation and siege and so on, will that strengthening of relations between Egypt and Israel cement peace, or just cement a continuation of these sorts of medium-intensity conflicts that keep erupting in places like Gaza?
First, I agree with the surreal analysis, and I think the highlight of it was, during the negotiations when the regime, the Sisi regime, was very uninterested in having this port for Gaza, whereas the Netanyahu government was okay with that. And with other developments as well, I think the idea is to try to control any entrance or exit from the south by the regime, by the Sisi regime, and to make sure that put an end to Hamas there in terms of an eradicationist policy. But that's on one hand. On the other hand, I think the only peace that this policy can can bring about is when you eradicate Hamas and eradicate the resistance in general in Gaza. If that's possible, it will be a very bloody peace. It will be more of a 5 to 10 years until something else build up, because it's not built on strong, just foundations. But I think what would probably happen is that you will just have another cycle of violence, especially when you have more regional partners getting involved in the situation here. We have Iran, we have Syria, we have Turkey, and we have Qatar, who do not necessarily agree with the eradication policy of the Sisi regime in Gaza, and not necessarily agree as well with the Israeli policies vis-a-vis Gaza. And then the conflict becomes just a matter of logistics. There is no political settlement, and whenever you can get the necessary logistics, meaning the arms and the funds and the men, then it will just escalate.
Let's talk about gas deals now in the relationship between Egypt and Israel. Robert Springborg, a $60 billion gas deal is expected to be finalized between Egypt and Israel by the end of the year. Is that good news for Egypt's chronic energy shortages?
Well, it's better news than has been there. You noted in your introduction the shortage of gas and therefore the shortage of electricity in the country, so it's a profound problem. But there is a lot of opposition in Egypt to securing gas supplies from Israel. After all, there are many Arab countries that have lots of gas, Algeria being one of them, and Algeria has been supplying gas to Egypt. So whether this deal will be finalized, or whether this is to some extent an attempt by Egypt to get leverage over other potential suppliers, as well as to get leverage over the companies, the Western companies primarily, to which Egypt owes approximately $6 billion for gas that should have been exported but was used domestically in Egypt, remains to be seen. So I think it's still a little premature to say that this deal is indeed going to be done with Israel.
Right.
There would be a lot of repercussions in Egypt, economic and political, for it. So,
indeed, for sure. Let me bring in Daniel Levy, because we're running short of time. Briefly, Daniel, from Israel's perspective, the official thinking, I know you're not an official Israeli official right now, you're not in government, but help us to understand here, why not build your own LNG plant or export elsewhere rather than rely on a country that is currently rocked by political instability? What is the thinking in Tel Aviv?
I share the assessment that the deal may not go ahead. I think it could also become a target. I think Israel wants to lock in this relationship. I think it would add, of course, if this gas deal went through. But I think we should understand that many things in the Middle East are driven by energy. The Israel-Egypt relationship right now is not. If this deal happens, it will be another brick in the wall. But this is all short-termist. The bigger question is, are Israeli and Egyptian policies, the Egyptian crackdown domestically, the Israeli position on the Palestinians, going to contribute to stability, or are they driving radicalization? And I fear that it's the latter, and I fear that the Israel-Egypt relationship sadly demonstrates that Israel will not be more secure in a more democratic Middle East, and is more comfortable with military leaders, certainly for as long as the Palestinians are disenfranchised. So the gas story, I think, is important to look at, but I wouldn't over-focus on it.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests, Omar Ashour, Robert Springborg and Daniel Levy. And remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Egypt on air and online. I'm Sami Zeidan. Thanks for watching. It's goodbye for now.